Well, hello, everybody. I have 1 p.m., so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Iowa Community of Practice. Happy Valentine's Day. Really great session today. Really excited about our presenter and our topic. Let's take care of a couple housekeeping things before we dive in. Thank you to the DD Council and IVRS for their continued support of the Iowa Community of Practice. And as you all know, I'm Jessica Craho with the Iowa Coalition for Integration and Employment and a member of Iowa's Employment First leadership team. The COP is a collaboration, right, between the DD Council, IC, and IVRS, and a number of Employment First partners. And we're in our 9th year. So thanks for your continued support and engagement, right, in the community. Today's session will be recorded and will be shared back out with the mailing list along with any materials and resources. If you're not a member of the mailing list and would like to be, or have a team member that should be, just shoot me an email at pruittjess@gmail.com and I will get them added. Yes, Jean, you may get a certificate of attendance today. Thanks for bringing that up. You may get certificates of attendance. Again, just reach out to me and let me know you need those. I can't give you an official CEU, but I can certainly demonstrate that you are here, right? So I can provide that. Just shoot me an email. I'll share my email again in the chat once we get going. Captions are available. You can pull the stream text link out of the chat. Thank you to our lead captioner, Heather, and the Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation, right, of the Georgia Institute of Technology. We love partnering with them, so thank you very much. And so I think without further ado, I think I got all the housekeeping things. Go ahead and stay muted. But as we move along here, if you have any questions or comments or reactions, or as Isaac engages us here in some really important and valuable discussion, go ahead and open up that mic or just share your thoughts in the chat. So I think without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to and hand it over to Issac Carter with the Coaching Imperative. He joins us today from likely sunny Florida, I'm guessing. And Isaac's a colleague of mine and really does some outstanding and amazing work. I think you all are really going to enjoy our discussion today. And we're really going to focus today on recognizing and taking a deeper look at bias and implicit bias, our own, that is, right, and the impact of bias on our work and our decision-making and our behaviors, right, both at work and outside of work. And then talk about some strategies for minimizing or managing bias, right? And our own bias, including emotional intelligence and other really thoughtful ways to expand our cultural literacy and our emotional intelligence. So I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the wonderful Issac Carter. Thanks, Isaac, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jess, for that very gracious introduction. I need to hire you to do that professionally for me.
Anytime.
You have built up the expectation, so hopefully I will deliver. My name is Issac Carter. I'm going to be moving back and forth from some slides, leave opportunities to ask and field questions, and then have some activity for us to do at the end if we have time. And so I'm going to share my screen with you and we will get started. Jess, can you monitor if people have hand raising or like in a queue? Sometimes I can't see those things as I'm presenting in the chat, so we'll go from there. And then overall, I want to just kind of share with you my rule of thumb is that I'm coming to you with a particular set of information on how we can deal with bias and using emotional intelligence. Feel free to add to the discussion if you have other things you want us to consider and talk about. I want this to be an opportunity for, while I might be having a specific thing I'm talking about, but in this space, I hope we can learn together. And if you have things, insights that will be valuable for the discussion, please share them. All right, so people hopping on. So I'm going to start out by sharing my screen. Make sure I can do that. And then, so here we go. All right. So utilize emotional intelligence to understand bias and difference. And so I'll start out by sharing with you. My name's Isaac, for people jumping on, Issac Carter. I'm a coaching consultant educator with Coaching Imperative. And I work with GHA and Jess on different projects around equity and inclusion and diversity. So thank you for being here. And so the point I want to make and underscore from the beginning is that I think emotional intelligence is the missing link to DEI work. And the reason I share that with you is because I think that as we talk about DEI work, and over the 25 years that I have done it, and engaged, with different people from all over the country, in some cases the world, one of the things that always becomes a sticking point is how we feel during that training. Because something said or something is shared that invokes a feeling for us. And those feelings, which I'll talk about later, can have an effect on your receptiveness to diversity and working with issues like anti-bias. But also, I'm going to explain to you there's an economy for those feelings that we function in. And that economy is still built in the same way that our physical world is. This emotional economy, it puts the feelings of certain people above the feelings and emotions of other people. And it creates a similar level of disparity emotionally within the experience. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So to get us to a shared place, I want to offer some definitions. These are not necessarily the definitions for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I'm sharing with you as we begin this process together so we can have some shared language that we can draw from. So diversity is the appreciation and prioritization of different background identities experienced collectively and as individuals. So it's a diversity that we all bring. We have equity, it's the knowledge that all people in all communities are starting from the same place due to historic or current systems of oppression that limit access to opportunity. So we have diversity as this difference, and equity is like, okay, within this difference, I'm recognized that everybody is not starting from the same place. And the third is inclusion. And inclusion gets into our ability to a state of belonging, where now that we have diversity and we're working to achieve equity, is do people feel like they belong and are welcomed to the organization or to the group, but not just in their representation. I think it's important that we underscore that that means decision-making, and collaboration amongst colleagues and peers. So it's not just having a seat at the table, but it's also having some ability to suggest what's on the menu. And this is some shared language I like for us to use and adopt as we think during this session today, these topics. And so I want to start out and introduce the APA apologizes for racism. The reason I think this is an important point to underscore, it just happened in 2021, which is rather new. And I believe that what it did, it was for those of us in the helping profession, those of us are drawing from counseling-based theories and methods and what we do in our job. It's important for one of the lead organizations, if not the lead organization, in that psychological cognitive realm, is apologizing for racism. What does that mean? And part of it obviously is a recognition of the harm that has been caused in terms of how theory and research and methods have been developed over time. But also I think it's an acknowledgement and understanding, just a consideration of, wait a minute, as we talk about this global reckoning that people are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, whether it's gender, whether it's pay equity, whether it's environmental issues, what does this mean for us? And what they did, I'm gonna share with you, is there are 4 definitions of racism and 4 components of it. And then I think the last 2 are gonna be very especially interesting of us for this time we have. So first off, there was structural racism. So that's in laws, that's in policies and practices that produce these inequities in our society. And those structural things are built because our structures were built on exclusionary premises. Like it was thought about like in terms of who could vote, who was a citizen, who had civil rights, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that we corrected along the way in this country, but those things had to be corrected because there was bias built into them when they were constructed. The other is institutions. So the institutions that we all are part of are part of the structure, the larger overall arching structure. So you see here is policy and practices such as schools, healthcare, law enforcement that marginalize diverse racial groups. And I would add to that, women, people of color, LGBT population, et cetera. That's why we continue to have the type of tensions that we have in our society, because this is a complex issue to try to get to the point of a equity mindset, but let alone, I think we should move into our equality overall as we all shared this humanity together. So we have the structures and institutions. So we are part of those structures and institutions as people who work for structures and institutions and provide services to whoever we provide services for. The next part, and where it gets, I think, start for us to understand bias is that internalized racism refers to the acceptance of negative societal beliefs or stereotypes by oneself. Now, I want to make sure that it's clear that when we talk about internalized racism, and this is the definition that APA uses, I would push back and challenge them a little bit and say that whether you are white or a person of color, whether you are a man or a woman, we internalize those oppressions anyway. So it's not just the person who's of the marginalized group that's internalizing an idea about themselves. We are internalizing these stereotypes about others simultaneously, and that's happening. And when that happens, then it gets us to the point of our interpersonal racism or our interpersonal oppression, where we because we are part of structures, are part of institutions, are part of understanding the internalization of stereotypical thoughts. Interpersonally, because of bias, implicit bias, which we're not always aware of, doesn't function at a conscious level, we can then behave in ways that diminish and harm people that belong to different racial groups or other groups. And so as we are moving forward today, it is important and essential that we understand that what I'm trying to say is that no one is better than another person. No one is more flawed. We all, in some ways, are complicit in this system that we are creating and maintaining, just as we come to this space today as an opportunity to change these systems and structures. But it starts with us first, internally. We have to start from within to develop the lens and the competencies to be able to address change in our society. And I think the APA Apology on Racism was a positive step for that, for all of us that are in the helping profession. Now I'm going to move on to, since we kind of saw this structure and we saw how it works from the structure, institutions, internalized and interpersonal, then we're going to get into a little bit more like what is bias and how do we recognize bias. So first and foremost, bias runs counter to people's consciousness and expressed beliefs. So you can be affected and operate through implicit bias and say all the coolest things, progressive things you ever think of out loud. You can be that person that everybody's looking to and say, wow, you are freaking great. That person, when they talk, I learned everything they say. I'm gonna go out there and follow them. Aren't they a model citizen? And in many cases they are, but it doesn't mean that they are free from bias. It just means that they are generally people who understand and have a mindset and idea of what they want in society, but we're still on an unconscious level trying to figure out how to make that happen, given all the things we have been socialized to believe about each other. Then next we have, when we look at beyond our own control and awareness, that these operatives beyond our control and awareness, is that these are things in the head. These, like, imagine little bitty people inside your head telling you different things about people, and you're always trying to test it against yourself and say, wait a minute, is this really that? Because I've this interaction this way, but I've been socialized this way. That's where the part which you're becoming aware of your bias, your intentions. And as we move through this process, the ability to recognize that, and we're going to use EQ to do it to help us move to the next level. The other part is that informs our perception of a person or social group. Again, we have these scripts in our head based on how we socialize, when we see TV and media, etc., that we get certain scripts. So we have our internal idea, but then we get these perceptions of groups from other external forces. These forces, in terms of implicit bias, influence our behavior and decision making. And because we don't know how they operate, we're affected. We only can really know when we are aware of how we affect others, and we have more awareness of how systematic inequalities are in place in our work. But we understand that bias is not also about thoughts, it also includes behavior and how we make decisions. And then the other part about this that, again, people who are committed to work deliberately, without prejudice, negative stereotypes, still can happen. Again, good people that are committed still can mess up. And it's one of those things that I think is important for us in this cancel culture that we are in. I'm personally frustrated with it as a person who does diversity training, because I don't want people to feel like they can't mess up. Most likely, you're going to mess up. You're going to say something that offends someone, say something that makes people slightly uncomfortable, because we're not used to having this dialogue. And I'm hoping that we can embrace a concept of amnesty when we're meeting with people. It doesn't mean you don't hold them accountable, but we still treat them as human beings. We still have them a part of our community. We still allow them to interact. And if something was harmed by their actions or thoughts or behaviors, let's give them the opportunity to atone. What we want to do is we want to kick people out of it because they did something wrong. And I think we should be inviting people not just to come to the table without any kind of atonement, but also come to the table with some empathy and generosity, because we were all socialized in the same way or similar way. And at any point in time, our implicit bias can show up. So I want you to know, for me personally, as a person who lives and does this every day, besides being a man of color who tries to operate as a Black male feminist, that still in the world, I still say things to my partner, and she says, that sounds kind of patriarchal right there. I'm like, what are you talking about? But I can't be what you're talking about. I have to be, well, that was what she experienced. Let me figure out, ask some questions. So I'm gonna do this again, because happy wife, happy life in general. And who's gonna win the argument anyway? Not me. Not even worth it. But the point is that we still, even if you're in this work and doing a lot of it, you still can mess up. And I figure I've been on the planet for 48 years, and I'm still trying to unearth all the ways I've been socialized to think differently about people. So these are 4 types of bias that I wanted to emphasize that are common. So affinity bias, which refers to our tendency to gravitate to people similar to ourselves, makes perfect sense. Why would you want to hang out? Why wouldn't you want to hang out with people that are similar? But when we do that, we should think through who we're leaving out. And is it a real reason on what is similar? Are we similar because of what attribute? Are we similar because of our race? Are we similar because of our gender? Are we similar because of education? Are we similar because of some other factor? I was watching a program that was describing, let's say it's called a militia group in our country. And they were talking about wanting to get back to some common things where we fish and hunt, and we live off the land, and we have communities support each other. And I was like, I want to live where they live. I want the same things. But in their mind, they have some affinity bias set up where other people don't want those things. And I think that's where we need to challenge ourselves when we see and we like, and we think other people don't like those things. Is it really true? Or are we basing these on some stereotypes and some implicit bias that we have about those groups. Then, which leads us to attribute bias, which refers to the errors we make when we evaluate and try to find reasons for our and others' behaviors. And so I had an incident in my own neighborhood on our group chat that there were some cars speeding and they were doing donuts in an empty lot. And so a person recorded it. And the person made some attributes that they thought of who the people in that car was. And let's just say those attributes weren't positive, but more importantly, ultimately, when the police caught them, they weren't true. So this was something that I experienced on my phone that I had to deal with scrolling, and because of the way I posted it, it can be deleted. That happened in my neighborhood, but it was based on attributes that weren't even really true, but that's what the person thought. And so this is a way that's a form of bias. Confirmation bias would then lead us to the fact that, let's say the incident of the donuts happened 10 times in a week. And 9 of those 10 times, it wasn't the person or the group you think it was. But the one time that it is that group, you're like, aha, that's it. I told you. See, them people, those over there, them, all those words we use to divide come into play. That's part of the confirmation bias. And then we have the overconfidence bias. And I think this is a dangerous one because I feel like, even for myself, this is one I have to be conscious of, because when you study a topic and you work with it over years, you develop some level of understanding. And in some spaces, people call you an expert or somebody who's knowledgeable. Overconfidence bias is one of the most dangerous things for those of us who understand and have some training in bias, because it refers to our confidence in our judgment to be objective. But we're not all objective because we're still people. We can try to be objective, and we should use certain skills to become more objective in our viewpoints. But understand that because of where bias operates, we can have overconfidence in our ability to navigate bias, and that can affect our judgments and our assessments of people. And again, this doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means you're just human who needs to continue to do some work to be aware of how bias affects others. Now, I'm going to stop for a second. I've talked a lot about bias. I want to see, are there any questions that people have out there about anything I've presented so far? So I'm not saying you have to do this, but I see names on the screen and I might just magically pick one. I'm not trying to pick on you. I'm just hoping we can have a little interaction. So I'm gonna start with people who have pictures. So Angela, do you feel like you want to share anything? But if you don't, it's okay. If you don't come on the screen, I'm not gonna hold it against you. I see up in front of me, Douglas. It seemed like you're leaning into the screen. You may want to say
A
something.
little bit. No, I'm just listening. I'm enjoying the lecture.
Okay. I hope we can get a little conversation. Anybody
All
else?
right. If I can
Thank you.
think of anything, I'll talk.
Thank you, Douglas. I'm gonna have some specific questions later on, so I appreciate it. Anyone else may thinking they want to share anything? If not, I'm gonna continue, but you'll have opportunities later to participate. Guaranteed.
Isaac, I was trying to come up with examples based on the different biases you were showing us that might show up in our work in employment services, or specifically just kind of like related to people with disabilities. So I know that they're right, that there's a lot of intersections there, right? So, you know, race, gender, identity, all those things. So I was trying to think though of kind of those examples, you know, and I don't know if they were right, but you know, like to the definition, but I was trying to do that because I feel like sometimes that I might do those things, and or that I'm hearing, you know, I'm a part of conversations or work or whatever, where I might see or hear some of those things, or, you know, I think that I do. And so I was just trying to think of that, because to your point of just trying to maybe approach those with empathy, and generosity, you know, so being able to like talk about it or kind of call it out and say, you know, maybe we're making assumptions or we don't have high enough expectation, you know, those kinds of things based on our bias. Those can be hard conversations to have, I feel like, amongst ourselves. I have a hard time having those conversations sometimes.
Yeah, they can be very difficult. That's why we're going to jump into emotional intelligence. I'll share with you, my mom is a therapist, and part of growing up as a child, she worked with families with children with different learning abilities as well as physical abilities. And so one of my favorite of her clients she used to bring to the house was a young man, the name will stay anonymous, but he has certain physical limitations and he has certain mental limitations, but he's a really good shot at basketball. Like he had a remarkable ability to shoot the basketball. It was like crazy. I think I would say he could shoot it better than me when I was young because he could make 10 free throws in a row like almost every time. And so a couple of times I took him to the park with me, and people were like, "Oh, he ain't not gonna be able to play. What's he doing out here? Why are you doing all this?" And it was so amazing when people saw him shoot the basketball, how they instantly fell in love with this young man, and it changed their perspective. They saw him as this person who, I'm gonna use the word, because this is in the 90s, 80s, handicapped. That's why you bring this handicapped person out here. But then when they saw that he could play and actually contribute, it changed the whole narrative. And I never remember get that experience because in the beginning, I didn't want to take him to the park because I'm like, I don't want to put him in, me knowing everything, I don't put him in a position where he's going to be taken advantage of, and I can't make him feel bad. This should be a positive, positive interaction and all of that. And I have all my reasons why, some biases, some attribute bias and other things can be included, my overconfidence and my judgment. And it was the best thing ever, and it opened up a cool part of our relationship in terms of me working with him to be able to, in my mom's mind, thinking of better socialize with people at school and in life. But I was already doing that because I was part of the problem. And so that to me, that's an example in terms of like how you can apply this to your work possibly. And if other people have examples, feel free to put those into the chat. So if there are no other examples, I'm gonna jump back in and share my screen again. And so we're gonna move on. So next, I want to engage the idea around looking at culture and understanding differences. So we set up this idea about bias. We talked about structural racism, internalized, interpersonal, etc. Talked about the 4 different types of bias. Now we're talking about culture and understanding differences. So this is a quote from Edward T. Hall, and I'm gonna read it so we can emphasize this. Culture is man's medium. I understand for the women in the house, that's very patriarchal to be left out in that way, but we will still listen to Edward T. Hall, even though he may have made a mistake in terms of being inclusive language. There is not one aspect of human life that is not touched and altered by culture. This means personally how people express themselves, including the show of emotions, the way we think, how they move, how problems are solved, how their cities are planned and laid out, how transportation systems function and are organized, as well as how economic and government systems are put together. And this is a very important quote to ground us to understand that there's a deep connection between culture and our emotions. And I will make the connection deeper between culture, emotions, and our goals for equity. And so we have to start from the understanding that our culture and what we consider ourselves as to be is part of how we interact with each other, but also how do we respond to each other and respond to difference. These things are culturally based. So we have for ourselves, there's a visible culture where we see, or the objective culture, which is we see age, physical traits, gender, physical abilities, and I would say gender expression now in this point in time, to update that slide versus gender, skin color and behaviors. And then we have those things underneath that are subjective. And the subjective are those patterns and beliefs and perceptions that are learned from one's group that guides individual and group activity and expectation. So this stuff is driving your activities as well as how you expect others to be and behave. But if we think through the definition of culture, we understand that the expectation that we may have for others may not be appropriate, because they might come from a different cultural background that has a different set of activities and expectations. And so what happens when those two people or those two groups are interacting? What's natural to happen is tension. What's natural to happen is conflict. What's natural to happen is those biases seep in. So what are we going to do if this is our landscape? We understand culture to be this system. We've understood how we all have been influenced at some level operate with implicit bias. And we have cultural differences. What are we going to do? It sounds like I'm painting a bad picture for us to always be in conflict. That's what I'm trying to do.
Well, and I don't hate to interrupt, but while you have that on, Isaac, and I never sent this to you, but remember I told you Iowa recent, an investigation completed by the Department of Justice was recently completed by the Department of Justice in Iowa on our resource centers and then just in our wider service system, right? Mm-hmm. And found that we, in fact, this is an opinion, we have a culture, right? A disability services culture, a culture in which we institutionalize people, or we tend to favor that, right? Versus community-based settings and community-based services and offerings. And that's tied, in my opinion, to maybe expectations or bias, right? Around mm-hmm. persons with disabilities or those with the most significant disabilities. So again, just trying to frame or just expand that, right, again, into like our work, and everything that Isaac is saying is right, like obviously to race and culture and all those things, but don't forget about right, the disability culture and this and kind of the intersections with that, I think. Yeah,
I think oh, we have comments?
No, I think that was, I made a weird noise. I think I bumped my desk. Sorry.
All right. Yeah, I think that's important observation to make, Jess. And I think when we talk about institutions like to do the same thing with people. And I'm gonna use a word, when we use institutional frameworks, we create very similar institutions. The word I would use is isomorphic, but don't need to use that word. But that's what the word I think about, because we create these institutions and how we're going to handle diversity. I would even share with you that in the DEI space, it's just a bunch of regurgitating the same stuff. And it's not being effective. And in some ways, I've been complicit in that, in some way to try to move away from that. And I'm hoping you'll see that in terms of what I'm doing around emotional intelligence and recognize this economy of emotions. Because I believe we've been working on how people think. We do some DEI training, anti-oppression, history, something about a group of people. We learn about the group, the region, etc. Then we'll do some things in terms of how we train people on how to communicate and without bias and oral written communication, what to say, what to capitalize, what letters to use. Mm-hmm. And then we talk about doing something, and we talk about how we can be in spaces. We want to create spaces where people they belong to them. So like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging.
Yeah.
But when we say that, who wants to belong to an organization that has all these problems? Who wants to actually still be a part of an organization that still has these struggles? So I think we've tricked ourselves into believing that this state that we're in is the natural state that we're going to be in for a while and move forward. There's a note in the chat. Work with a young man who stated that he can't because he has one hand, that I can't came my bias, and his hand became this, his. Okay, yeah. I think there is something to that, because we should we should treat all our clients interactions, I think everybody, with the idea that they have their own assets internal to them, and they're not just who or what their ability is. And I think that's part of that whole people first language we want to use. So it doesn't become about the person with one hand, but it's about the person first. And I'm sure we all know that, and we talk about that. Thanks for the comment. And so as we move forward in our discussion today, I want to reinforce too that part of what our institutions are structured on, and like that comment about having one hand, we are built on a binary logic of classification. So we don't make much room for gray area. So we have these lists of terms, and I bet all of you can imagine right now the opposite list, because this is how we function. We use a binary logic to interact with each other, and we don't make rooms for the intersections and the gray space that may exist in any of these categories, let alone the intersections of these categories. So again, if we talk about a person and their abilities, we also have to consider their abilities and their gender and their sexual orientation and their language skills. There's no universal person that has these certain abilities. We all are different, and all those things are still at play, but oftentimes in the disability world, people get labeled and treated just for that. And we want to be more inclusive in our mindsets and make sure that we're not using this binary logic that we have of a person, because they don't have this, they can't do this. But leave room for the person and you all to discover another way or multiple ways to do those things and be open to that. And so to get to that point and to do all that, this is where I think emotional intelligence is key and vital. And emotional intelligence is simply just being smarter with emotions. And so what I want to share is that emotional intelligence is the ability to integrate thinking and feeling and to make optimal decisions. And part of that awareness is be able to make decisions in the way we're talking about, make sure that we can make anti-bias, non-discriminatory, and inclusive and equitable decisions. We want to be able to make decisions that actually help change and transform people's material lives for the positive, not the negative. And to do so, I think we have to be more aware of the emotions of others in these discussions, but more importantly, be aware of our own emotions, because those emotions operate in a particular economy of thought. And so when we think about all the emotions that we have, here's a wheel, there's more emotions than this, but we don't really know a lot about emotions. Maybe this crowd does a little bit more. But there's 8 basic emotions, and people are generally operating within that 8. One thing you know is that emotions are neutral. And this is what, for us, I'm part of the 6 Seconds Emotional Intelligence Global Network. And as a preferred partner, we talk about emotions are neutral being one of the first things we want to share with people we work with, because we have this idea of things like anger or fear that may have some negative attributes to them. We're simply saying those things are data. Fear is not bad. Anger is not bad. It's just data. It's emotional information you get about what you experienced at that time. What you do with that data, it then becomes more important. And then in the realm of bias and anti-bias, more importantly, be aware of how those emotions can drive certain behaviors. Another thing, that emotions are contagious. And so when you're in groups and you're with people that may be part of your affinity, it is not unnatural for the emotional state of some people who are leaders or perceived as people who have a certain gravitas to them, that those emotions can affect the entire group, and you don't have to be aware of it, because emotions become contagious because we're social beings, and it can influence our ideas and how we feel about things that can happen on the group level very easily, just like it can happen on the individual level. And another thing about emotions is that emotions are absorbed in the body in 6 seconds, and emotion produced or absorbed in your body, they regulate a lot of functions and how you breathe, your breath, your heart, your lungs, all things are happening. And then from those 6 seconds, those emotions turn into feelings, feelings turn into thoughts and action. It's a simple equation, but it's something that we have to be aware that these emotional experiences are happening all the time and they're firing. And we have to be aware and more aware of them, and not only our own, but other people, then to figure out how to do this when we're talking about the tough discussion, like Jess has mentioned. When you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion in space, these conversations can be tough. When you're talking about working with people's abilities and the intersection of those abilities, it can be tough because there's a lot of history behind them. There's a lot of mistrust behind them. There's a lot of anger behind them. A lot of fear that's discussed. All of those emotions are there. And how do you work through it and navigate? And so I'm suggesting that we do more work and build our inner capacity to deal with difference by making a more clear connection between emotions and culture. And so when you connect culture to emotion, we understand, then we can provide a structure and rules to understand and express how emotions are expressed. We have a mindset that emotions are different. We can use scripts and how positive and negative emotions should be experienced, because we're learning now that there are no positive, negative emotions. Those emotions are just data. When we connect cultural emotions, we can then understand how we are constrained in many ways by culture and expression in a given cultural context. But we don't have to be confined by that if we know those things exist. We can choose individually to respond how we want to. And then a cultural context also adds the cues when people are trying to interpret facial expressions and emotions. We can leave room for different types that may go outside of our norm and what we see as being normal. And so connecting culture to emotion, again, gives us the focus on the emotional level of our interactions and making sure that we have open guidelines for how people can behave and express themselves. We have open guidelines in terms of the scripts that we think. We have open guidelines in terms about the cultural context and the constraints. And if we do that and make room for it and have empathy for ourselves and others, it allows us to have more fruitful conversations about these tough, complex issues that we're trying to challenge. So I'm gonna stop for a second right there. There was a long.
Great example shared in the chat. So Angela shared a really awesome example or experience. She says, I think we assume that there are limitations when we see a person with a disability before we get to know them. I recently assumed that someone that has verbal limitations needed a more simple explanation of what I wanted from them. I learned my lesson when he schooled me on a better way to set up and serve meals to seniors in our area. His abilities were different than mine, and his perspective was really valuable. We are still using his way versus mine. My bias got in the way.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I wonder how many more opportunities we can have if we make room for thinking about and appreciating people's differences. And understand that, yes, a person has a disability, they also have assets. They have wealth in other ways that we don't know. And how can we work with the whole person, not with just their ability? And what does bias do in that process? So thank you very much for that example. Any of us want to have an example or a thought they want to share before I kind of move to our last part in our time? All right. Let me share my screen again and get back into this. So this is where I want to live for a few seconds, or a few minutes. This comes out of the Work Institute for Emotional Justice. And this is my updated version of what I think the next progression of their work is moving towards. So they put out this concept that is emotional superiority. And they've talked about in research how, particularly around race and gender, that the emotions of dominant group members are privileged and prioritized at the expense of non-dominant group members. So part of what they suggest is that at the very idea of a thought that would go against the norm, that when you say to that boss or that person in charge, we wonder how they would feel if we talk about or do this thing related to diversity, that's the point where they're are entering to this emotional economy, because they're concerned about the well-being and fear of another person. And that becomes a priority institutionalized when those in leadership are from the dominant groups, and it reinforces a subjugation of other people's emotions. And then they describe this economy as a place where power dynamics are formed and maintained to protect dominant group members. So you have superiority and you have the economy. And despite the debate we're not having on certain topics in our society, the debates often talk about, we want to stop people from feeling this way. If we do this thing, we don't want to make our young people feel a certain way. Like, for example, history. We don't want to share some parts of history because some parts of history make some people feel upset. So we don't talk about it. But it's not acknowledging that the history that we talk about now already makes people upset, especially those that are not included or excluded to the margins of that history. So there's an economy of our emotions that our bosses and leaders have that we are attending to it all the time. And then this idea of emotional currency. And so this describes that when marginalized communities are treated in a certain way, it appreciates or depreciates on their matter of service to dominant culture. So if you all having guests right now, I've been a person in organizations that sometimes cause trouble because I'm always trying to advocate for diversity. If I see, for example, as at a real school, I saw this, that every major in this particular department was male and every teacher was male, yet nationally, the numbers were almost inverse. And I called a question, why did that happen that way? And I got in trouble. Well, they try to get me in trouble. I don't really take trouble kindly. My stock did depreciated on that campus because that person was a person that was high up and well regarded and liked, and of course said all the right things. So they said to me, Isaac, well, they say all the right things. To the earlier slide we had earlier, talking about we can have people where you operate on implicit bias, but be the person saying the most revolutionary, idealistic things. This was that person. But because I made them feel differently than they wanted to feel, and I was suggesting to not care about their emotions in this because this is their life's work. This is what they built their life on. This is what their research is. How can you come and attack that or cause a kind of viewpoint they may look at it negative? That wasn't what's happening, just pointing to an inequity. But the emotions became the key thing that I had to attend to. And then so the last part of that, then now I have to exercise a certain emotional labor to make sure that the dominant group member understands that I can help them achieve their goals. I may not want to do that, but to be able to gain and reclaim some of my agency within the organization, I had to engage into some emotional labor to help this person that was already in a superiority complex, and it has emotional security and superiority, to then now be able to interact with them in a way that I was attending to how my questions made them feel. Because ultimately I had damaged the relationship because I called to question something that made someone feel this way. And so in the work of Equal Justice Institute, they have countless examples of how policies and practices, and these are things that we know nationally, like redlining was a policy in place that's still in place in some places that was about keeping a certain emotional economy and a certain emotional security and superiority. I don't want to live near those people because I'm not sure who those people are and what they do. We have that now in terms of education, in terms of what can be taught. I don't want my kid to learn these things or be exposed to these things because I fear it's going to make them do something that I don't want them to do. These things are happening to us all the time. In many ways, the stock market is based on the emotional currency of how people feel about a certain particular product and the confidence in it. And so we have to become more aware of how we are fitting into and playing a part, and what is our currency within this cultural taxonomy of emotions. And are we reinforcing ideas of oppression or discrimination or bias as we participate, either from how we make others feel or how what we feel shows up in our work? And so if you're afraid of something, what is the chances of you working and giving that thing or that person the best you have opportunity? It's a basic, if you don't like snakes, you shouldn't be a snake charmer. You're probably not gonna be good at it. There's a healthy fear of the snake and biting you and dying, you might not do that. And so we have to be able to understand and be aware of our emotions, not regulate them, be aware of our emotions, and think about, as we do our work with people we serve, how am I participating in this emotional economy? Am I putting the emotions of others or them ahead of my own, or vice versa? Or am I not proposing this because I don't think they'd be well accepted or thinking of highly regarded? Those things become the stopping blocks for us to move beyond progress. And I'm not saying you shouldn't care about how people feel, but you shouldn't let how people are going to feel drive what you're going to do. It just means we have to spend more time building those relationships to be able to navigate those emotions. And so to do this, I have this system of competencies that we should engage. And this can be talked about in some more in-depth way later on, but I wanted to listen to you now. So emotional intelligence, what you see in the blue box over to the left are part of the 8 emotional intelligence competencies of 6 seconds. And these enhanced emotional literacy, which means understanding emotions, recognizing patterns, be able to see those patterns in people's behaviors. Consequential thinking is obviously thinking about decisions and how they're made. Navigate emotion means harnessing your emotions as a strategic resource. Doesn't mean controlling your emotions. It means harnessing those emotions. Engage intrinsic motivation is be internally focused and driven. Exercising optimism is thinking about not only optimistically, but what things can you do to facilitate optimism in terms of how can you set up people for success so that you can be optimistic about their results. Increasing empathy is obvious. It's obvious. It can be more empathetic, but also be empathetic to ourselves in a way that we are still learning and we're going to make mistakes, and when we do, it's okay. Doesn't mean it should happen all the time, but it's okay. It's part of our process. And pursuing noble goals, which basically is that you have ideas or goals you're pursuing in life that are about bettering the world. And this is the framework we use in the 6 seconds. To the right, I'm developing a tool for 6 seconds where we engage cultural emotional intelligence based on our understanding of emotional intelligence. So we're going to increase cultural emotional awareness. And what cultural emotional awareness is what are the things that are often associated with diverse interactions. So we have guilt, we have shame, we have anger, we have fear, and we're more aware of those emotions and how they happen. Recognizing patterns and not is moving to acknowledging systems. So we understand that patterns are not arbitrarily happening. They are part of systematic formulation, as we learned from APA. They're part of structures, institutions, individuals, and interpersonal interactions. That's where patterns come from. We engage in intersectional thinking. And what that means is non-binary. So it's not good or bad, right or wrong. We're willing to play with the gray area. And we're also willing to have different decisions made in different cultural contexts. Receive emotions graciously. I'm trying to offer this for all of us. When you hear people and they make mistakes, receive that emotion graciously. When people share their experience with you and their frustrations or their life experience, receive those emotions graciously. Your job is not to invalidate or validate the emotions, it's to listen and be able to hear what the person is saying. Identify cultural wealth means as all your clients you have, they have things within them that they are forms of wealth. It could be knowledge about communities. It could be linguistic wealth. It could be family support. It could be resistance and resilience. These are all things that people possess. And so when you're meeting people, you try to identify what are they wealthy in, not in the sense of monetary, but those attributes and traits that are going to help them achieve their goals. Imagining equity is believing that we can actually change the world. For me, it's not just doing this stuff because we think we have to do it or it's the soup of the day. This is what we really actually believe to make our humanity better and we can have a shared humanity where everybody can prosper. Compassionate curiosity is having the courage to ask those questions, but in a way that's compassionate of things you want to learn about and know. If you see a behavior that's a little different than yours, ask about it. Hey, Jess, I noticed that when we talk on the screen, that you don't move your head or your eyes and you don't make any emotion. That's not you, obviously. And I'm kind of figuring like you might not be liking my presentation. That's me making an assumption, me not knowing, and you not really, you being labeled before you even get a chance to respond. So how can we have that conversation compassionately when you receive what I said as not being a diss, and I received your response and receive those emotions graciously. And lastly, a daily practice. If we're going to get better at working with each other, we should do this daily. We should be making new relationships, forming new networks. I'm challenging everybody on the screen to join a network they're not in. I know that there's been challenges in different affinity spaces. We might have women groups this, men group that, people of color this, Asian that, all those things, LGBTQ. Whatever you're not, I encourage you to go to that group and see how you receive and figure out a way to be received in a way that allows you to learn and grow. That's the only way we're going to do it. We can't do it by listening to me talk on this screen. I'm just trying to give you some tools. You guys have to go out and practice it. And it's a practice of our humanity. We are meant to be different. We benefit in society because we're different. We need to understand that more and embrace that more. And that's how we're going to solve the problems that we have, whether it be with your clients and their employment or larger issues of the structural institutions that keep them away from opportunities of employment and be able to be on their own. However, we have to practice this every day. And so I'm gonna stop right here, right now. And we're at 2:57. I had an exercise, but we're almost at time. Maybe I just show the slide. We won't do the exercise real quick. Just real quickly, the exercise was going to be that you had a situation where you have an interaction and coaching that didn't go well. I want you to think back to what you felt. If you're switching again, what would you want to do different to have a different outcome? And what were the responses that you can use? So basically, you can go through this thing and saying, they can't do this because I'm frightened for them. And my action was to shout, like, no, you can't do this. What if they can't do this, but I'm going to be optimistic about how they could possibly, and I communicate my concerns, but also make room for their feedback so they can do what they want to do and we come to some mutual conclusion. It's an exercise that we do often in coaching and EQ work, that we have choices. When we think something, it comes from an emotion. What we feel comes from an emotion. How we act comes from emotion. So if you're aware, you can stop yourself and in 6 seconds, wait that 6 seconds, and think about how else can you alternatively respond to the situation. What other thoughts maybe inform this interaction? What other feelings can inform my and other person's outcome? And what actions can I take to facilitate what I actually want based on my thoughts and feelings? That's the TFA cycle. But anyway, I'm gonna stop there. We're at 2:58. Wow, time flies.
When you're having fun.
Yes, when you're having fun.
And you make this understandable and fun. So I was looking for the proper emoji when you were talking to us about the cultural taxonomy and that kind of a breakdown of the 4 pieces. I mean, to think of right, all the examples, right, that we see in life across DEI, right? I just gosh, that just makes a lot of sense. That framing, right? The framing of it, I think, is so helpful. And then to figure out kind of how I fit in it. And like you said, the thoughts and behaviors that I do in support of kind of each of those 4 pieces. Because I am definitely within groups that are considered emotionally superior. Right? So white, non-disabled, cis, heterosexual, right? These kinds of things. So I loved that framework. I thought that was incredibly helpful. And again, I went straight to the disability kind of culture example, but Anybody else have any thoughts or reactions to some of these last pieces? Oh, while we do that, I'm going to grab our.
This is Kirsten, Jess, and
Hey,
Isaac,
Kirsten.
thanks. I really appreciated your session today. And I think the most, for me, I was thinking this, and then you hit on it, nailed it right at the end, that, there's a lot of new stuff today in the session, but also a lot of reminders, but change isn't going to happen from listening to somebody talk about it. We have to
Yes.
take those steps and immerse ourselves into situations where we have to practice the tools that you talked about today. So I really appreciated that closing.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here. And if anybody wants to follow up with me and learn more about these practices, please feel free to reach out to me. Jess has my information, but you can find me at coachingimperative.com. And so I work with individuals and groups to help us be able to be better with DEI and leadership.
Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, let me know. I'll share Isaac's contact information out with the materials. I dropped the link in the chat for the evaluation. Please let us know if today was valuable and helpful and some of your takeaways. I see Salama, thank you. She says, thank you, great presentation. Angela, really loved this training, left me with some tools that will help me with some diversity issues we're seeing now. Monica says, thank you. Yeah, so some really great takeaways. And I think, yeah, so please complete the evaluation. I'll share out all the information, and then we'll be back in March 15th with the first part of an integrative approach to job development, which is going to feature Nancy Brooks Lane, our favorite, one of our favorite Georgians, right? She's going to come talk to us kind of all about best practice and evidence-based practice around job development, right? And kind of all the strategies and tools that we can utilize and add to our tool belt to help get the outcomes that we want. So join us again March 15th, and I'll get everything sent out to the mailing list. Thanks, y'all. Have a great day, great rest of the week. Stay warm. Thank you, Isaac.